welcome to the ARC Energy Research Institute video series, and I'm happy today to be here with Samantha Gross. She's a fellow at the Brookings Institution, and maybe you could explain a little bit about the Brookings Institution.
Sure. It's a think tank in Washington, D.C. We've been around for more than 100 years. We're best known for our foreign policy and our economics work, and we're pretty moderate on the political scale.
Okay, so you cover energy and climate and policy, so I want to talk to you about that. So number one question around here is the U.S. actually pulling out of Paris or not? We've had mixed messages.
Yeah, we have heard some mixed messages. There were some mixed messages coming out, but the message from the top appears to be that the U.S. does still intend to pull out of the Paris Agreement. They've kind of left themselves this little escape hatch. Well, if the agreement is negotiated in a way that's more favorable to us, we would come back. But the Paris Agreement is not going to be renegotiated, so I would count that as a no from the U.S.
Okay, so sometime in the next 3 years, you would expect that it would formally withdraw from the Paris Agreement.
Well, we actually can't formally withdraw, and this is fascinating, until November of 2020, actually the day after the next election.
Wow.
So you can assume that we'll move towards withdrawal with the current administration, but it will actually kind of depend on the next presidential election, whether they actually pull the plug or not.
Right. Okay, so with the U.S. withdrawing, it seems like that's the more likely scenario. What does that mean for other countries? Do you think that they're going to lose momentum in terms of their own commitments that they made under the Paris Agreement?
Well, for the most part, I think that other countries have primarily redoubled their commitment to Paris. I think they've been quite frustrated by the Trump administration's stance. The commitments that were made at Paris are voluntary, and they're no more or less voluntary now than they were when they started. So I think they're kind of redoubling their efforts in expressing their frustration with the Trump administration. One thing from a U.S. foreign policy perspective that's been frustrating me as an American is that I feel like it puts the U.S. out there as a less reliable partner for other kinds of international agreements. And so we've seen that as a problem, but I don't think we've seen other countries pull away from the Paris Agreement.
Okay, and what about this green climate fund? So part of the commitment for many countries was basically contingent on them getting some financing from other countries like the U.S. So with the U.S. not funding that anymore, does that decrease the chances of those countries really following through on their commitments?
Let's talk about the Green Climate Fund for just a second. So the U.S. pledged $3 billion to the Green Climate Fund. We actually already gave $1 billion of that pledge under the Obama administration. So it's the remaining $2 billion that it looks like is probably not coming. The U.S. pledged the highest value amount to the Green Climate Fund. However, we weren't the highest on a per capita basis, just because we're a big country. Mm-hmm. So other countries are largely keeping their commitments to the Green Climate Fund. That money is flowing. There's actually a secretariat set up in South Korea, and they're starting to work through grants and send that money out now. So it's disappointing, and it's a smaller amount of money than we thought it would be, but that mechanism is still very much alive and working.
Okay, so there's money coming to those countries, and there are some activities to reduce emissions.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, backing up a little bit to the Paris Agreement, the headline that came out is that they wanted to meet a 2-degree goal and maybe eventually a 1.5. But those commitments that were made, did they get the world on that track?
They didn't, and that was not unexpected. The way to bring so many countries to the agreement was that it was very flexible. Bring us what you think you can do, and we'll add it all together and see what we get. And so that initial process did not get us on a path to a 2 degrees C goal. However, the way the agreement is set up is that every 5 years, countries revisit their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, these pledges that they brought to Paris. And so every 5 years, they revisit those with the idea that they'll become more ambitious as technology improves, as countries learn from each other about how to implement cleaner technologies. And so it wasn't a big surprise that the first round of commitments didn't meet the 2 degrees C goal.
Okay, so with the commitments that were made at this point in time, how likely do you think it is 5 years from now when they meet again that many of the countries are on track with what they agreed to?
It depends on the kinds of countries. A lot of the developing countries were a bit less ambitious. If you look at the commitments that China and India made to the most important and largest developing countries, they are on track to meet their commitments. They're both intensity-based commitments, so they allow growth in energy demand and CO2 emissions commensurate with or slightly less than the rate of economic growth. Whereas if you look at the U.S., the EU countries, large industrialized countries, they're largely not on track. they were quite ambitious in their commitments, and they really pushed hard on the commitments that they brought to Paris, and they're not yet on track to meet those. The Paris Agreement didn't have a lot to say about implementation. It was more focused on overall goals. And so it's time now for everyone in all these countries to go back and think about how to put their countries on a path to meet the goals that they brought forward. And they're just not there yet.
So actually make those policy changes to really reduce emissions. So, I learned a lot from this conversation. So, despite what's going on in the U.S., it looks like there is a lot of activities happening and a chance that we'll be on the track maybe in 5 years to see some reductions. So
absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah. So thank you very much, Samantha, and thank you for joining our video series for the ARC Energy Research Institute.